So you can see the number on the top of the slide that 50 to 70% of alliances research shows they end in failure. But here's a key question: what constitutes failure? Specifically, is it a failure if there are two parties in an alliance and one of them walks away unhappy and one walks away happy? And that opens up this whole can of worms of what do people want out of an alliance and what constitutes success for them. And that's something you're going to see on the next slide. I'm going to encourage you to ponder. You can read the slide and see why alliances tend to fail, all the same reasons that mergers and acquisitions sometimes don't go well. Although it gets down to sometimes you think you're going to get one thing in an alliance, and it turns out the partner is unwilling to give that one thing or those things. And then the last bullet gets that suggestion that they're just using you to get what they need, and once they have what they need, they're out of there and they're on to their next thing. And again, I could quote you many alliances where that's been the case. I'll talk about some ones that are ongoing today where that is certainly a fear. But given that, that raised that interesting question: is conflict in an alliance always a bad thing? The knee-jerk answer is, well, of course it's a bad thing. Why would we want conflict in an alliance? And I read an interesting quote by a senior executive. He says, if my folks don't come to me periodically and complain about our alliance partner and don't allege that they are getting away with murder or they're not giving us everything they said they would or they're getting the better end of the deal, if that doesn't happen periodically, then I worry that we really did get the short end of the stick and we just don't realize it yet. So it isn't whether there's conflict, it's how that conflict is worked through and on what issues there are conflict. So now, how do you pick an alliance partner wisely? Just like for an M&A, for an alliance partner, it's kind of like marrying your spouse. You want to pick very, very wisely. You want to make sure that the reasons are clear and they're enumerated. And you, more than anything, I think you have to ask and answer that question: what do they want out of this alliance? And I'll give you an example of that. There was an article several years ago in Aviation Week and Space Technology talking about Airbus in China. Airbus agreed to build their most popular selling airplane, the A320, in China. They opened up a second production line as opposed to the one that's in Europe. Very transparent about why they did that. They want China to buy more airplanes, and we'll be talking about that in the global chapter. What do the Chinese want out of it? Very transparent about that. They see themselves long term as developing an aviation an aviation manufacturer that's going to rival Airbus and Boeing in terms of the construction of global airliners. And so they want to get the manufacturing know-how. They want to basically learn from Airbus how you build a world-class jetliner. Well, what was amazing about the article is Airbus says, we know that's what they were doing this for. They know we're doing this to sell airplanes. It works for both of us. And they were very clear about, we're going to keep our best technology in a black box, and there's not going to be any Chinese that get into that part of the factory. And we're going to hold that sacred, and they're not going to get access to that. Everything they get access to is basically about for us to jump one more generation ahead of that. So we know they're going to learn, but they're always going to stay behind. And like I say, what was striking about the article is how honest everybody was, because you think those things, but you don't usually say those things. So then you want to go on with all these good feelings, and as much as I hate to say that, you need lawyers, but you also want to have contracts sufficient to the task, but contracts that are open to new opportunities. You want to build trust, and one of the key things of leadership in the front end is doing things that build trust, to give some reciprocity or to extend, be trusting in the beginning on an issue and allow them to be trusting back and let it move forward from there. And then the idea of just committing to the relationship. If you're going to build some sort of an integration function, who do you put there? Do you put the average Joe or Josephine? Do you put kind of your cast off, or do you put one of your superstar executives that maybe you're grooming for a higher post? Obviously, if you put your superstar in there, then people are going to go, hey, this alliance is important, and your best people are going to want to be assigned into this alliance integration function because they're going to see it's good for promotion. And the research does show that the best, most stable, successful alliances are equity alliances. So how do you do this? Successful alliances tend to start small, build on success, and get bigger over time, which means they have to be open to evolution. Also, Successful alliances tend to have a clear business case. In other words, you can explain to everybody and have them, get at why you're doing this alliance. And finally, the most successful alliances, again, it's almost by definition, they're ones that have longer time horizons and you expect to go for the distance. So now I want to wrap this up and give you an example of, it's a nice segue into the global discussion, alliance gone wrong. And that was the case of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. In the beginning, the plan was that about 66% of the construction would be done by non-Boeing entities. For example, the wings, in fact, are built exclusively in Japan, different parts of it. Key parts of the tail of the airplane are built in Europe. Fuselage was built by a company called Vought in Charleston, South Carolina. And then the idea was those parts will all arrive at the assembly plant in Washington State, and it would go from all these various parts to looking like an airliner. Not that it was finished, but all the parts would be snapped together, and then the finished work would begin in about 3 days. The benefit for Boeing was financially, because there was a lot of new technology in this airplane, it allowed them to share the research and development costs with all of those partners. Also, and again, they're fairly explicit about this, they expect to sell airplanes because it is seen as a global product. The launch airline for the 787 was a Japanese airline, All Nippon Airways, ANA. Well, what happened? The plane was delivered 3 years late. They had a tremendous sales advantage over Airbus with this airplane, and then they promptly fumbled the ball with poor execution. They did not save money because of the cost overruns, and in the end, Boeing chose to bring some of that work back in-house for subsequent airplanes. So it was a bridge too far, whatever metaphor you want to use. Here's the thing that I want you to draw out of this lesson. One of the things you give up when you choose to work with an alliance partner as opposed to doing it yourself is you have a loss of visibility and a loss of control of key aspects. And that's what really did Boeing in. Now that I've criticized it, here's the interesting question. In something like a 787, where it is a decades-long transition, the book is still out as to whether that alliance was all those alliance agreements were a bad idea, because they'll be validated over time. Like I said, this stands as a nice segue into the global chapter, so join me on the next video and we'll dive into that.